welcome back to another video. Today I want to talk about Beatlemania and the whole idea that the Beatles really only made their way to superstardom because of their fan base. I feel like it is so often looked over, and women are kind of looked down upon as being fangirls. But what people don't understand is the power that these fangirls had and have. They not only fueled Beatlemania, they were the ones responsible for the Beatles becoming so widely successful. And it is a phenomenon that we see over and over again, because in the end, no matter how great your music is, if it doesn't reach the masses, if the people don't love it and have some sort of connection to it, it almost doesn't even matter. So today I want to take a look at fangirls in generally, but especially the ones of the 1960s, how they fueled Beatlemania and how they were the ones to make four lads from Liverpool world famous.
I don't care what anybody thinks. I love the Beatles for them, and I'll always love them. Even when I'm 105 and an old grandmother, I'll love them. And Paul McCartney, if you are listening, Adrienne from Brooklyn loves you with all her heart. I love you, Paul, and please come to the window so I can just see you. I saw you smoking before, and I kissed the limousine you looked out of. But I love you, and I want you, Paul. Please look at it. And Ringo, you can look at it too, because I like you.
Adrienne was just 13 and lived in a cramped Brooklyn apartment, her telephone wires rigged to alert when any mention of the Beatles crackled across the AM radio. She wasn't famous, just one of thousands of girls clutching a vinyl single to her chest, certain that within its groove lay the promise of a different life. She was not yet a name, only a whisper in the corridors of anticipation. Girls cradling glossy fan club pins in trembling hands, dreaming of an impossible encounter. Then, on a frigid February evening in 1964, the black and white glow of television flickered to life, and four mop tops emerged beneath the bright studio lights. In an instant, a scream tore through living rooms across America, carried on the breath of 15-year-olds who felt as if their hearts might shatter from longing. But it wasn't just the music that propelled these Liverpudlian lads to superstardom. It was Adrienne and every girl like her whose collective devotion became the engine of an empire. With each frantic letter she mailed, each screaming chorus at a concert, each lunchbox and badge she bought, Adrienne wove the very fabric of their legend. Without her and the army of devoted fans she represented, the Beatles would have been four young musicians with talent but no spark to ignite the world. This was Beatlemania, and yet its thunderous echo was born of shouts and sights that came long before, from the fainting fits in European concert halls to the fever dream of a silver screen Latin lover, from the jitterbug-tinged hysteria of the 1950s to the very first collective intake of breath that defined modern fandom. Because to understand the fangirl is to understand the beating heart of pop itself. Their screams were the visible force that lifted four young Liverpudlians from local stage to global legend. And without those girls, their songs would have remained whispers instead of anthems. The Beatles' meteoric rise was not born of chords and harmonies alone, but of every heartbeat in that front row chorus of devotion. Chapter 1, Before the Beatles, The Roots of Fandom. Some may believe that Beatlemania were the original fangirls, but taking a closer look, this phenomenon is actually much older. Imagine a grand salon in 1844 Paris. Candlelight flickers across polished pianos. Franz Liszt, tall, eccentric, otherworldly, lowers his hands from the keys, and the audience convulses. Ladies faint into velvet upholstered seats. The breeze of half-played concerts, broken piano strings, discarded cigar stubs fought over like sacred relicts. German poet Heinrich Heine, watching the spectacle, dubbed it Lisztomania. In his feuilleton published on April 25th of 1844, he marveled, quote, "And yet how convulsively his mere appearance affected them. What acclaim it was, a veritable insanity, one unheard of in the annals of furore." This was more than admiration. It was collective transcendence, a moment when art and idol merged into pure emotion. Turn the page to 1926 New York City, where Rudolph Valentino lay stricken in Polyclinic Hospital. Word of his failing health spread like wildfire through the silent film crazy America. In the weeks before his death, letters, telegrams, calls, and gifts flooded into the hospital as he battled for his life, a testament to the deep yearnings his image provoked. Then Valentino finally succumbed on August 23rd. Over 10,000 mourners surged through rain-slickened streets, pressing against lines of policemen to glimpse his casket. The funeral was no ordinary farewell. It was a public exorcism of collective desire, proof that even grief could be a currency of fandom. By 1956, Elvis Presley's television debut had unleashed a new breed of infatuation. On stage, Elvis sang and danced his heart out. Off stage, teenage girls ascended towards ecstasy. Meg Reynolds of the Vancouver Sun captured it best on August 31st of 1957. Quote, "It is a frightening thing for a man to watch his woman debase himself. Girls who screamed and quivered and shut their eyes and reached out their hands to him as for salvation. The power these girls wielded wasn't in silent adoration, but in the voltage of their collective voice, each scream a spark that lit the fuse of popular culture. They proved that fandom could move mountains of prejudice and reshape the very contours of celebrity, turning private longing into public spectacle. Yet, even Liszt's fallen devotees, Valentino's grieving masses, and Elvis's quivering disciplines were only prelude. When 4 mop-topped Liverpudlians stepped onto an American stage, their fans' devotion exploded into a supernova of fervor. Beatlemania would not only top everything that came before, it would redefine what it meant to be a star and what it meant to belong. Chapter 2, Beatlemania, the birth of the modern fangirl. By late 1963, British newspapers were already reporting, quote, teenage girls screaming, crying, fainting, and chasing the band down the street after the Beatles' Palladium show. Yet, in America, they were still a curiosity, until that one fateful night they took Ed Sullivan's stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, here are 4 of the nicest youngsters we've ever had on our stage. The Beatles! Bring them on!
No sooner had Ed Sullivan finished speaking than a tempest of screams washed across Studio 50, drowning out the opening notes of All My Loving. It was as though the audience itself had become an instrument. Its tremolo of high-pitched cries both soundtrack and catalyst for the greatest pop invasion the world had ever seen. In many ways, this is the singer of the fangirl and musician. Her screams bring him on stage, carry him through the night, and dictate the energy of the show. By the time the Beatles launched into Till There Was You, cameras panned over sea green dresses and bobby socks, girls pressing forward, faces slag with rapture and excitement. In that era, before in-ear monitors, the Beatles literally could not hear themselves play. The wall of sound they created was equal parts amplifier as audience. The girls became part of the music in their very own way. But soon Capitol Records and CBS executives realized what Liszt's and Valentino's handlers could have only dreamt of. The screaming fangirl was not collateral damage, she was gold. They would wait for hours on end to meet their favorite musicians, camp out in the rain and spend their money on tickets, and these girls were so full of love and loyalty for their idols that they had the very power so many managers dreamed of. They could propel a band into superstardom. From fainting parlors to weeping crowds, these early rituals of devotion laid the groundwork for everything that followed. For many teenage girls in the 1960s, the world felt governed by an unspoken code. Sit still, speak softly, look pretty, know your place. Yet, in the hush of school corridors and the quiet of their bedrooms, a different revolution was stirring. One conducted not with banners, but with breathless gasps. At the heart of fangirling lies a paradox, an intensely personal attachment formed with someone you may never meet, a parasocial relationship, a one-sided emotional bond that offers all the comfort of friendships without the messiness of real-world rejection. For adolescent girls, standing at the threshold of selfhood, this bond served 3 key elements. First, identity formation. Quote, being part of a fandom facilitates psychological development and an exploration of your own identity, writes fan studies researcher Janie Turner. What she calls, quote, finding community and shared passion. In a world that told them who to be, fangirls chose who to belong to. And I feel like that is still very true until this day. Nothing beats the feeling of attending a concert and knowing everyone else in the room feels the same way you do, or going online and reading posts about someone else's love for the Beatles. In the end, that is what this channel is. We're all here bonding over our love for the Beatles, the 1960s, and vintage treasures. Secondly, emotional catharsis. We really cannot talk about the fangirl without talking about her scream. Screaming wasn't just noise, it was a release valve for pent-up feelings. In the words of crowd psychology scholars, the fangirl scream is both competitive signaling, a bid for attention, and emotional contagion. The impulse to join the collective chorus. It said, I am here, I exist. And in the 60s, this was revolutionary. Women were taught to sit still, look pretty, and don't get overwhelmed with emotions. A young girl was expected to clap and smile at the music, but not to fully immerse herself to the degree of fainting and screaming. In a sense, their screams were part of a rebellion, but they also became an elect for the performance. If you ask me, these screams are a huge part as in why live concerts, even on film, are so great. There's this immediate feedback, the energy shifts, and screams carry the band through their set. The screams are contagious. Even watching back live performances of the Beatles, these screams make my heart beat faster, because I know exactly how they feel. And third, safe romantic fantasies. Young women longed for intimacy at a time when social norms still circumscribed female desire. By investing hope and longing into an unattainable idol, they could enact a romantic script without risk, flirting with the idea of love but never the aftermath of heartbreak. Even though realistically the chances of these girls ending up with a Beatle were incredibly slim, they could dream about it every night, and their wish of being close to them fueled their buying power. Magazines, pictures, pins, whatever had the Beatles' faces on it was sold by the millions. Why are teenage girls so prone to fangirl culture? Adolescence is by definition a time of liminality, caught between childhood safety and adult responsibility. Fangirling offered control. Girls chose which images to surround themselves with, which lyrics to treasure, and which personas to emulate. And it also offered community, as they formed fan club chapters, swapped signs, and shared secret smiles over glossy pinups. And finally, as mentioned before, empowerment. In an era when young women had very few public roles, the front row of a concert became the stage of their own making. When the Beatles burst onto the Ed Sullivan stage in 1964, record labels and managers recognized that teenage girls weren't just spectators. They were stakeholders. Brian Epstein's polished suits and shrewd instincts crafted an image of 4 eligible bachelors, funny, charming mop tops unencumbered by wives or girlfriends. However, that wasn't quite the truth. John Lennon had gotten married in 1962, but his relationship with Cynthia Powell was kept secret for 3 years, a closely guarded confidence that preserved the band's mystique. Charlie Watts almost didn't make the Rolling Stones because they were afraid that him being married would take away from their bachelor appeal. Brian Epstein and Capitol Records discouraged any public hint of pairing, knowing that the fantasy of accessibility, the thought of "he could be mine," was a powerful marketing tool. Every photograph, every autograph card, every teen girl scream was packaged and sold as proof of devotion. This strategy was hardly unique to the Beatles. It became a blueprint for teen idol marketing. Agencies learned that the less real the relationship, the more fans could project their deepest hopes onto the figure, and the more music they would buy, tickets they would chase, and magazines they would devour. Chapter 3: The Pink Press and the Marketing Machine. It was September of 1965 when the first issue of Tiger Beat slipped onto newsstands. Its collaged covers promising gossip, photos, and fashion tips aimed squarely at 13-year-old dreamers. Founder Chuck Laufer later admitted that the magazine's DNA was rooted in one simple insight. Quote, guys in their 20s singing la-la songs to 13-year-old girls. No one quite knew what to make out of these mop-top heartthrobs until they saw the numbers. Tiger Beat sold hundreds of thousands of copies each month, proving that the adolescent female gaze was nothing but trivial. But Chuck Laufer also knew how crucial it was to have these articles written by someone who felt the same. In the last episode of The Dolls Pod, which is a podcast that I host with my dear friend Abby, and which I always have linked in the description box of all of my videos, we spoke about Anne Moses. She started out as a writer for Tiger Beat, interviewing bands from the perspective of a fangirl, and eventually even became the editor of the magazine in her early 20s. As said, the episode is linked down below, and I would highly recommend you to check it out. Abby actually got the opportunity to interview Anne. I unfortunately couldn't make it with my schedule, but these two had a chat, and it is so insightful into this whole machinery, because the idea that these fangirls knew exactly what to ask these boys and musicians and how to portray them to then sell them to other fangirls was very crucial. I honestly think that this is so interesting because teen magazines were a huge part of my childhood in the early 2000s and 2010s, and to think back that it all started in the 1960s with these girls, it's just so incredible for me to think about. It's just really interesting to see that these magazines realized how crucial it was to hire young girls to tell these stories. At the same time, 16 magazine, under the editorial eye of Gloria Starvers, was shepherding readers from Elvis Presley to the Beatles, Herman's Hermits, and the Monkees. By 1964, its pages were christened faves, anointing the bands that mattered and quietly dismissing those that didn't. And this truly is where the switch happened. These magazines, because they were sold by the hundreds of thousands each week, didn't only report on who was cool, they now had a say in that. It didn't only came down to the music or performances anymore. Becoming famous was now also about being charming in interviews and the perfect picture of a teen girl's boyfriend. The girls who bought these magazines started to request more articles on certain bands and people, thus propelling them to bigger stardom. Between Tiger Beat and 16, the Pink Press created a parallel pop universe, one written in second-person addresses like, "Are you the kind of girl George Harrison is looking for?" and buoyed by the promise that every reader's devotion was both acknowledged and rewarded. These magazines were different than other music magazines because they weren't about the music. While the Rolling Stones magazine or Cream was focusing more on music, these magazines focused more on the people behind the songs. Young girls didn't care so much for only record reviews. They wanted to know what Paul's favorite color was. They wanted to read about George describing his perfect dream date. And they wanted to know what Ringo's favorite brands of shoe was and which perfume John Lennon did use. Soon, Tiger Beat, 16 magazine, and Fanfare gobbled up every photograph, every rumor, packaging longing into glossy pages sold by the millions. From button badge tributes to branded lunchboxes, the teenage girl became a target demographic. Her scream had a price tag, one that record labels and sponsors learned to respect. The Ed Sullivan broadcast didn't just introduce the Beatles. It codified the relationship between pop stars and their most fervent followers. Every chart-topping act since stood on the shoulder of those first unforgettable screams. Chapter 4. Beyond the Scream, Letters, Diaries, and Lost Youth. In the hush of her bedroom, she was both chronicler and devotee. Finger poised over her diary's first page, the world beyond her curtains reduced to a distant murmur, while the Beatles took center stage in her imagination. Long before social media carved out digital communities, fangirls built their own networks with mimeographed bulletins and typewritten newsletters. Titles like Fab4 Fanatic or Beatle Beat were compiled by candlelight, stapling photocopied photos and hand-drawn cartoons into issues that circulated among school friends and postbox pen pals. As fan studies pioneer Henry Jenkins observed, quote, "Fanziness served as both a record of shared passion and a workshop for fan creativity, offering spaces where young women could articulate their desire and refine their voices." Step into a fangirl sanctuary and you'd see the walls plastered with cutout headshots, school lockers plastered with hand-torn photos, and pinups that turned every glance into prayer. Tiger Beat's signature collaged covers, headshots arranged like constellations, became templates for homemade fan art, while magazines like Bob and Rave offered full-page posters to pin above the bed. As Mental Floss observed, these glossy publications, quote, "looked like the inside of a 13-year-old girl's locker door. Every hue and layout designed to invite daydreams and collective longing." Behind every pin-prickled teddy bear patch and enamel button lay a deliberate strategy to transform affection into commerce. Brian Epstein's early merchandising deals flooded markets with Beatles lunchboxes, thermoses, and badges. Each item a variable declaration of loyalty. As NPR's Maria Gatto noted, quote, "A lunchbox was not merely a lunchbox, but a statement of who we were. These tokens arrived at the perfect moment. Youth suddenly had disposable income in the 1960s, free to spend on whatever they liked. While most adults balked at their children's obsession, these young girls spent every last penny on memorabilia. Collecting badges, pins, and dolls was itself a rite of passage, an act of self-definition. In the muted clink of metal badges and the soft thud of a fallen thermos, each fangirl found her voice, her tribe, and her place in an industry that was only just learning her power. But this devotion came at a cost. Weekend allowances and money hard-earned as a shop girl or tutor vanished on mail-to-order packs. Curfews were broken in pursuit of a glimpse outside a hotel window. Letters were smuggled past parents who feared the emotional toll. One Washington Post feature from August of 1964 captured the tension. Quote, "Mild-mannered Mary Sullivan whispers that she's ruined for math class, spending nights penning tear-stained letters instead of studying. Her mother worries aloud, when will she ever look up from those Beatles pictures?" These sacrifices, both social and financial, became rites of passage, marking a girl's transition from childhood security into the uncharted territory of her own longing. With scissors, glue, and a red felt-tip pen, fangirls turned glossy pinups into new visions. They layered photos of John's cheeky smile over Paul's soulful eyes, and noted lyrics with personal commentary and constructed dream albums of unheard tracks. These early mashups, prefigure fan edits, proved that the impulse to reclaim and reshape pop culture has always been at the heart of the fandom. One collector's archive at the University of Liverpool holds a scrapbook from 1965, its pages busting with color-coded dress patterns and margin doodles, a testament to girls' ingenuity and ownership of their desires. By 1965, local Beatles fan clubs staged meetups in town halls and church basements. Girls swapped leathers, traded rare vinyl, and organized so-called locket-making circles. These were craft sessions where they fashioned beloved braided friendship bands in the band's signature hues. These gatherings dissolved the distance between anonymous devotion and communal identity, forging bonds that outlasted any concert. As one attendee recounted in an oral history, quote, "It wasn't just about the Beatles anymore. It was about us, sharing our secrets, our hopes. We weren't just screaming fans. We were a sisterhood." Many of these girls tucked away their creations under beds and behind bookshelves, fearing parental rebuke. Decades later, those diaries and signs re-emerged in charity shop bins, silent witnesses to a moment when girlhood and genius intertwined. Their pages remind us that fandom was never about passive consumption. It was an act of self-fashioning, a way to claim agency in a world that offered young women so few stages of their own. Chapter 5, America in Crisis, Beatlemania Hits Home. The moment America first heard those mop-top boys on television, it was as if a collective heartbeat had skipped and never caught up again. When the Ed Sullivan Show introduced the Beatles to a national audience of 73 million on February 9th of 1964, nearly 2/5 of the US population, who watched as four Liverpudlians forever recalibrated the limits of devotion. Within hours, newspapers ran alarmed editorials. In the New Statesman, Paul Johnson dismissed the phenomenon as, quote, a collective groveling to gods who are blind and empty, decrying teenage girls as, quote, the dull idol, the failures, who flocked in moronic hysteria. To outsiders, it was incomprehensible, but to the girls themselves, it was everything. When the Beatles hit the road that summer, the frenzy reached a fever pitch. Because as wild and wonderful as Beatlemania was, it also had its dangers. Boston Garden, September 12th of 1964. 13,909 teens packed the arena, but few heard a single chord. As Paul counted in, a girl in the first row clung desperately to her seat, so fiercely that a police officer had to pry her free, while tears and screams blurred the stage lights into a single undulating wave. Just 6 days prior, on September 6th of 1964, the Beatles performed at Detroit's Olympia Stadium. Screams, fainting spells, and wild dancing overwhelmed the venue. Paramedics found themselves treating dozens of collapsed fans for hysteria and exhaustion, unable to stem the tide of convulsive devotion. Each city became a battleground of emotions, where medical teams and venue staff scrambled to contain what one journalist called an eruption of collective longing. Back at Capitol Records offices, desks ground under mountains of letters. In late 1963, Brian Epstein's UK fan club was swamped by 50,000 letters a week, forcing a complete reorganization of their tiny mailroom just to keep up. There was one woman in charge of all of these letters, Frida Kelly. We've also made a podcast episode on her. I'm going to link that in the description box as well. It was really interesting because what was so brilliant about making Frida do that was that Frida herself was the president of the Beatles Fan Club. Apple Record executives had realized what Chuck Lawfer realized with Tiger Beats, and that was the importance of hiring someone who adored the Beatles just as much as their fans for jobs like this. When Frida eventually quit her job, she took home one final stack of letters, and it took her several years to reply to them. I cannot encourage you enough to listen to the episode about Frida. It is so insightful because it basically just starts with her volunteering to do this. Brian approaches her and is like, would you like to respond to some letters? And she's like, okay, sure. And she lives with her dad, and at first she's like, just mail everything to my house. And within days there are stacks upon stacks, and it's so much mail that there's no way for them to put it. It doesn't fit in their mailbox. And Frida worked for years, pretty much replying to thousands of letters every single week, and she just wanted to make sure that every one of these letters was replied to in the proper way, because she knew, and so did Brian Epstein, how important it was for the girls and the fans who wrote these letters to feel seen and loved. Across the ocean, radio station WMCA's 1964 Lock of Hair contest drew 86,000 ridiculously earnest entries, each postcard and package a treasure chest of teenage hope, all clamoring for the proof that the Beatles saw them. These weren't perfunctory postcards, they were prayers, each envelope an act of faith that somewhere beyond the bright stage lights, their idol might recognize their face. Chapter 6, From Fangirl to Groupie, Crossing the Velvet Rope. She slipped through the side door, heart pounding like a tambourine in her chest. Beyond the velvet rope, the air smelled of sweat, cheap perfume, and the faint acrid tang of cigarette smoke. Here the idols she'd worshipped in glossy magazines stood no more than an arm's length away, real, fragile, and achingly human. Yet in that moment she believed anything was possible. In the early 1960s, a backstage pass was more than just a slip of paper. It was an invitation into a hidden world. For the teenage girl, it represented the ultimate proof of belonging. Suddenly, the distance between idol and admirer collapsed. The squeal of the front row gave way to the whispered hellos in dimly lit corridors. But this passage wasn't freely given. Girls learned secret phone numbers, schmoozed ushers, and traded letters with cut-rate agents. Each strategy a small rebellion against their own confinement. As one Rolling Stones reporter observed, quote, "Getting backstage was the dream. It was proof you weren't just another scream in the crowd." What begins as a parasocial crush can morph into an unvanished quest for intimacy. Psychologists note that the same emotional contagion fueling communal screams carries over into personal encounters. Once backstage, the fangirl's fantasy rush amplifies into a tangible pursuit, an almost desperate attempt to collapse reality and reverie into one. The promise of touch was the ultimate proof. Quote, "If I can get my hands on his arm," one groupie later wrote, "I can say I am part of his world." No one embodies this alchemy better than Pamela Des Barres, Miss Pamela to the rock world. A self-confessed Beatles fangirl at age 14, she soon found herself at Frank Zappa's feet, then in the arms of Mick Jagger and countless others. As The Guardian noted, quote, "Pamela alchemized adolescence Beatles fandom into a new type of adorer, that of the groupie." The fangirl to groupie pipeline is a really interesting one because there is this very fine line when a fangirl turns over into becoming a groupie. And these girls in the 60s, late 60s, going into the 70s, were truly the first real groupies of their time. And so it is really interesting to see how some of the girls took being a fangirl so far, in a sense, that they would give up a large part of their life to just follow their idols around. And it all came from the same desire to just be close to the idol you admired. Pamela's memoir, I'm With the Band, which I cannot recommend you to read enough, details how she and the GTOs, a group of girls calling themselves Girls Together Outrageously, blurred the lines between spectacle and sexuality, transforming backstage corridors into arenas of consent, creativity, and at times exploitation. Through her eyes, we see the groupie not as a mere appendage, but as a cultural catalyst, muse confidant and co-conspirator in rock's greatest myths. "We were the living heart of that scene," Pamela later wrote in her book. "We gave these men permission to be gods, and we paid the price for that worship." But as fun as the groupie life might have seemed, it soon took a much darker turn. As the 1970s dawned, a younger, tougher breed emerged, the baby groupies. Girls as young as 13 sculpted the Sunset Strip, armed with crumbled photocopies of their favorite stars. Lori Lightning and Sable Starr were among the best known, so legendary that, quote, "You did not fuck with Sable Starr," her friends warned, lest you be, quote, "socially iced" from the circuit. These adolescents embodied both empowerment and peril. They commanded attention, yet lived lives defined by power imbalances. I'm not gonna go into this too much here because it doesn't really belong into the video. I just wanted to say that the fangirls also were the starting point of that part of 60s and 70s rock and roll history. However, I made a full video all about baby groupies, which I'm gonna link here if you want to take a closer look at how all of that happened and what it truly meant. Some might argue that groupies are just fangirls, and to a certain degree that is definitely true. However, groupies broke the barrier of unattainability, which fangirls mostly didn't. The majority of fangirls would never meet their idols, and if so, only see them from afar or on stage or in a brief meet and greet moment. Unattainability became the most potent currency of rock and roll in the 1960s, and no one spent it more wisely than Brian Epstein and the Capitol Record brass. They knew a teen's longing burns brightest when hope remains just out of reach. From the start, Brian Epstein installed ironclad rules around the Beatles' private lives. Public dating was forbidden. As mentioned earlier, John Lennon's 1962 marriage to Cynthia Powell was kept strictly under wraps, so secret that press officers instructed journalists don't mention her name whenever they reported on John. Paul McCartney later admitted in the Beatles anthology that Epstein insisted, quote, "No girlfriends and photos, no late night dates. Our mystique depends on them believing we're all possibilities." Every handshake was staged, every candid laugh carefully framed. Record executives turned the press into willing accomplices. Fan magazines ran endless profiles of the eligible bachelor Beatles, each article emphasizing mob-top innocence and youthful availability. When a photo surfaced of George Harrison alongside his then-wife Pattie Boyd in 1966, Epstein's office moved swiftly. The image was quietly spiked as an error, explained away as a misprint. In studio interviews, the Beatles themselves parodied carefully crafted sound bites like, quote, "We're here to sing, not to talk about our love lives," which reinforced the fantasy that any girl in the audience might one day be the chosen one. This cultivated distance did more than protect privacy. It forged yearning. Psychologists identify such strategies as fuel for parasocial escalation. The more unreachable the idol, the more urgent the attachment. Fans weren't just buying records, they were buying hope. Each forbidden glimpse, each tease of a smile became a catalyst for dozens of girls to show up at stadium gates before dawn, clutching homemade signs, praying for a fleeting moment of recognition. And so, the velvet robe, once a symbol of backstage exclusivity, became the invisible barrier that built the Beatles legend. Chapter 7, The Darker Echoes, When Fandom Turns Fatal. The frenzy roared like thunder, ripping through every city the Beatles touched. Yet behind the euphoric haze lay moments of real peril, proof that the most intoxicating devotion can tip into disaster when desire and density collide. By the summer of 1964, the Beatles' live shows had become contact sports of devotion. Producer George Martin likened recording their Hollywood Bowl concert to, quote, "putting a microphone at the end of a 747 jet. The audience's screams were so deafening, the band could barely hear themselves play. In Detroit, security barriers buckled under waves of girls surging forward. In Vancouver, Variety reported 160 treated for hysteria and minor injuries after fans, quote, rushed the stage in a collective frenzy. Each chord struck, each lyric crooned became a siren song, drawing fans closer until the line between adoration and anarchy blurred." While the fangirl could dream about being with their idols and the special connection they had all day long, at a concert it became apparent that they weren't the only ones. Every girl in the audience wanted to be the one catching the eyes of the Beatles. But as wild and wonderful as Beatlemania and being a Beatles fangirl was, there were some dangers to it. Seattle, August 21st, 1964. At the Central Coliseum, management raised the stage by 12 feet for the Beatles' protection, yet nothing could shield fans from peril. One girl fell 25 feet from an air vent above the stage. When Ringo checked on her, she bolted back into the crowd, her screams swallowed by the roar. Over 4 nights, paramedics treated over 300 fainting spells and contusions, each one a testament to the physical cost of collective longing. Just a month later, the Beatles were at Boston Garden in September of 1964. Doors opened to lines around the block. As fans stamped in, dozens were trampled or crushed against railings. Nurses described corridors lined with limp bodies, their faces pale as sheet music, revived only by the cool compresses of first aid stations. While no fan death was directly linked to a Beatles concert, the hysteria spawned tragic mimicry. In Wellington, New Zealand, a desperate girl slashed her wrists outside their hotel when denied entry, her blood-stained plea echoing the pain of fans kept at bay. And in Adelaide, a woman flung her disabled son onto the Beatles parade truck, crying, quote, "Catch him, Paul," a moment that fused salvation fantasy with real-world danger. I want to emphasize here that the Beatles are in no way responsible for all of this happening. However, their management had fed into their perfect dream bachelor image for so many years at this point, and many girls had become obsessed. As wonderful as Beatlemania was, it was starting to get out of control. These darker echoes forced reckoning. Venue managers started hiring medical teams, installed crush barriers, and redesigned entry points to prevent stampedes. The spiral of hysteria led directly to the protocols we now take for granted. First aid tents at festivals, elevated stages with safety railings, and crowd control training that treats fans not as faceless masses, but as vulnerable individuals, driven by the same love that built rock and roll itself. I think it is also important to note here that the whole craziness of Beatlemania played a huge role in why the Beatles stopped touring. This was all too much for them, and who can really blame them? Just imagine going through this every single time you go on stage, and I truly understand why at one point they just wanted to get away from the spotlight and get back into the studio. Chapter 8, The Final Curtain, a legacy built on devotion. The lights dimmed for the last time, the echo of chanting girls faded beneath swept-up scarves and discarded programs. And in the hush that followed, a new truth settled over the world of pop. Without those shrill choruses of devotion, there would have been no Beatles, no Stones, no glam rock gods, no modern pop pantheon. From the earliest scream on the Ed Sullivan Show to the last encore at Shea Stadium, the Beatles' ascent was inseparable from the girls who propelled them. Brian Epstein and Capitol executives understood something revolutionary. Unattainability was the raw material of legend. By curating every handshake, every off-camera giggle, and every stolen glance, they let the girls supply the rest. The lust, the longing, the myth. In doing so, they handed teenage devotion its greatest triumph, the power to make 4 ordinary lads into global deities. What these fangirls forged in the 1960s and 70s still shapes the machinery of pop and rock music today. Every midnight single drop, every limited edition vinyl run, every secret live stream follows the pattern first drawn by Mob Top Mania. Number 1, maintain mystique. Keep love lives off limits. Let desire simmer. Number 2, unleash the merch. Turn adolescence income into a badge of belonging. And finally, number 3, tease intimacy. Let them catch a fleeting glimpse backstage, which will make them feel close to their idols and become a lifelong memory. Without those early screams, without the girls who packed letters, lined stadium gates, and plastered bedrooms in glossy photos, there would simply have been no demand for the spectacle that pop has become. They were the demand, the pulse beneath every chart-topping record and every sold-out tour. Imagine the Beatles stripped of their fans. No shrieks to drown out their riffs, no fan club newsletters to chronicle their every move, no paper-cut collages turning bedrooms into shrines. They would have been another Mersey Beat act, another bar band with talent but no catalyst. It was the girls, whether they were 19, 14, or 12, who transfigured chords into crusades, harmonies into holy rites. In the stillness that follows the dream, we realize fangirls were never collateral. They were the architects. They gave birth to the notion of the pop star as modern myth, and through their devotion, they wove the soundtrack of a generation. They transformed simple melodies into rites of passage, papering their walls with cutout headshots as though building altars of hope. They penned tear-stained letters, not in search of reply, but as offerings of devotion. and in their collective scream, they forged the modern myth of the pop star. An immortal image shaped as much by adoration as by artistry. Without the people, there is no group, John Lennon said in the Beatles anthology. We were nothing without them. In that confession lies the final enchantment. The stars may shine, but it is the constellation of believers that gives them light. Every riff and refrain was driven by the heartbeat of a generation, and it was the girls in the front row who taught the world how to dream. And for that, the world will always owe them its deepest gratitude and its sweetest nostalgia. So that is it for today's video. That is my take on Fangirls and Beatlemania. I would absolutely love to know what you think about all of this. Do you think without this audience the Beatles would have ever gotten as big? Do you think it was mostly due to Brian Epstein and his way of thinking? Or do you really think it was, like I believe, due to all the girls and the way that, of course, Brian Epstein fed into their desires and dreams, but it was also just the fact that these girls bonded over the music the Beatles made. And fangirls are so often underestimated or looked down upon as girls who just scream to songs, and people don't understand the power of those screams. So that is why I really wanted to make this video. I feel like this topic got a little bit of traction earlier this year when the whole Adrienne from Brooklyn thing happened. Basically, if you've missed it, this was also the start of this video. A video clip reposted by Paul McCartney was all over social media with this girl, Adrienne from Brooklyn. And he was basically like, whoever you are, I hope you're doing well. And then Adrienne's children told the story of their mother, who was sadly already passed, but how she lived a really normal life. But for a couple of years in her teenagehood, she was like 13 or something at the time, she was just so obsessed with the Beatles and what it meant to her. And just hearing that from her really showed me that often when you think about a fan group of a band, you think about this faceless crowd, and you really have to understand that each person in the crowd has this very personal feeling towards the band playing. So that is why I really wanted to make this video, and I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, I would love you to give it a thumbs up and maybe share it with a friend. Also, if you're new here, maybe consider subscribing. I would love to have you around. I hope you have a beautiful day. Go out, enjoy the sunshine. Take yourself some time to focus on you and your mental health today, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye, dolls!